A white officer stops a black judge at the courthouse, but what happens next is unbelievable. Leah Marshall was running late. Again. As she pulled up in front of the New Orleans courthouse, she glanced at the dashboard clock. Just 10 minutes until the trial was set to begin. Her heart quickened. This was the day she had both dreaded and meticulously prepared for. Today marked the opening of a high-profile case, one that could change how racial profiling was handled in Louisiana, maybe even forever. Stepping out of her car, Leah took a deep breath and squared her shoulders. As an accomplished black judge, she had weathered her share of adversity in the legal system. But this case hit different. It wasn't just another trial. It was deeply personal. The defendant, Kevin Daniels, a young black man, had been arrested in his own neighborhood without cause. The arresting officer claimed Kevin fit the description of someone involved in suspicious activity. Too familiar. Uncomfortably familiar. Leah's heels clicked steadily on the pavement as she strode across the parking lot. Instead of entering through the grand courthouse doors, where cameras and reporters swarmed, she chose the side entrance today. The main steps of the courthouse were swarmed with reporters, their cameras poised and ready for the story of the day. Leah didn't have time for the media frenzy. She made her way toward the side entrance, hoping to avoid the spotlight. But as she neared the door, she spotted a young white police officer standing guard. His posture was tense, his eyes tracking her every move. Leah reached for the ID badge hanging from her neck, part of her usual routine before entering the building. But before she could raise it, the officer stepped in front of her, blocking her path. "Ma'am, I need to see some identification," he said sharply. Leah blinked, caught off guard. "I'm Judge Marshall," she replied, lifting the badge clearly for him to see. "I'm presiding over the Daniels case this morning." The officer didn't even glance at the badge. His eyes, cold and unreadable, scanned her from head to toe. Leah felt a familiar heat rise in her chest, the burn of being questioned, doubted, judged. Still, she kept her expression calm. "There's been an incident nearby," he said, his tone laced with suspicion. "And you match the description of someone involved. I'm going to need you to answer a few questions." Leah stared at him, stunned, her mind reeling. The irony was suffocating. She was about to oversee a trial about racial profiling, and now she was being racially profiled at the courthouse doors. "Officer," she said, her voice steady, though her pulse was racing. "I don't have time for this. The trial starts in less than 10 minutes, and I need to get inside." She held out her badge again, hoping, no, willing, him to just look at it and realize his mistake. But he didn't. Instead, his hand hovered near his belt, close to the handcuffs clipped to his waist. "I don't care who you say you are, ma'am," he snapped, stepping closer. "You're going to need to come with me." Leah's breath caught in her throat. This was escalating. Fast. She saw it in his eyes, that same look she'd seen too many times growing up in the South. A dangerous mix of suspicion and contempt. This wasn't about her credentials. This wasn't about law. It was about the color of her skin. Before she could speak, a firm voice sliced through the thick air. "What's going on here?" Leah turned. An older black officer was striding toward them, his expression a blend of confusion and concern. His eyes shifted to her and widened in recognition. "Marshall?" he asked. "Judge Marshall?" "Yes," Leah replied, her voice tight. The older officer's jaw clenched as he turned to the younger cop. "Stand down." "Stand down," the older officer ordered, his voice firm and unwavering. The younger cop, still fuming, took a reluctant step back. "She matches the description," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "That's the judge," the older officer snapped. "Do you want to lose your job?" The younger man mumbled something under his breath, but finally backed off completely. Leah forced herself to take a deep breath. She had to stay composed. Losing her temper now would only play into the hands of someone like him. "Are you all right, ma'am?" the older officer asked, his tone softening. Leah nodded, though her jaw was tight. "I'm fine. Thank you." Without another word, she turned and walked into the courthouse, her heart still pounding. The familiar sterile halls greeted her with a sense of routine, a place where she was supposed to be in control. But the moment outside clung to her like a shadow. She had faced racism her entire life. But for it to happen here, on this day, just moments before this trial, it was almost too much. Inside the courtroom, the chatter quieted as she took her seat and banged the gavel. Court is now in session. The trial began smoothly enough. Opening statements were made, the facts laid out, objections handled with practiced ease. But Leah's thoughts kept drifting. Back to the officer's face. That sneering expression, the dismissive tone, the hand near his cuffs, the way he looked at her, like she didn't belong. Not even here. Not even as a judge. He had judged her in an instant. It felt too close, too personal, given the case now unfolding before her. The parallels were impossible to ignore. Then came the first witness, Kevin Daniels himself. Leah leaned forward slightly as the young man took the stand. His testimony was raw, unfiltered pain. He spoke of being stopped by the police for simply walking through his own neighborhood. No crime, no suspicious behavior, just existing. While black, he described being handcuffed, humiliated in front of his neighbors, treated like a threat for no reason at all. Leah felt the weight of every word. She had heard stories like this before, too many, for too long. But today it felt different. It wasn't just about Kevin Daniels anymore. It was about all the people whose names never made it to a courtroom. And it was about her. Halfway through the testimony, the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open. Leah's heart sank. It was him. The young officer from earlier, the one who had stopped her outside. He stepped inside the room, his posture stiff, his face pale and uneasy. Leah's gaze locked onto him, every nerve in her body suddenly on edge. He walked toward the front, unable to meet her eyes. The prosecutor stood. "Your Honor, the state would like to call its next witness, Officer Bill Wilkins." Bill Wilkins. Leah hadn't even caught his name outside, but now, here he was, on the record, in her courtroom. She watched as he took the stand, his movements stiff and uneasy. Every step he made was a reminder of what had happened just an hour earlier. Leah had to consciously remind herself to remain impartial, to stay professional. But it was hard. This was the same man who had looked at her not as a judge, but as a suspect. Officer Wilkins shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable. The confidence he'd shown earlier outside the courthouse had drained from his face. The prosecutor began, voice calm but pointed. "Officer Wilkins, please describe your role in the arrest of Mr. Kevin Daniels." "I was patrolling the neighborhood when I saw Daniels," Wilkins said, eyes darting briefly toward Leah. He looked out of place. Leah's grip on her gavel tightened. Out of place. She had heard that phrase too many times before. It was always the same tired code, a thin veil for racial bias. He was black, and I didn't think he belonged there. The prosecutor leaned in. "And what, exactly, made Mr. Daniels look out of place, officer?" Wilkins fidgeted. His hands clutched the edge of the witness stand. He was acting nervous, looking around a lot. It seemed like he was up to something. Leah felt a slow, controlled breath leave her lungs. Anger simmered beneath her calm expression. She had already reviewed the case file. Daniels had been standing on the sidewalk waiting for his rideshare. There had been no erratic movements, no crime, no suspicious behavior, just waiting. While black. He had simply been a black man in the wrong place, at the wrong time, at least in the eyes of the police. The prosecutor didn't let up. "Did you find anything on Mr. Daniels that suggested he had committed a crime?" Bill hesitated. His face turned a deeper shade of red. "No," he admitted quietly. "We didn't." A heavy silence filled the courtroom. Leah could feel the tension in the air, thick and unmoving. She glanced over at the jury. Some jurors looked visibly affected, their expressions softened by empathy. Others wore more guarded looks, their internal conflicts playing out in furrowed brows and pursed lips. But the truth hung in the room like smoke. Kevin Daniels had been arrested for one reason only: because he was black. As Bill continued his testimony, his story began to fray at the edges. Small inconsistencies crept in, details contradicted earlier statements, and his confidence evaporated under pressure. Leah watched him intently, noting how his eyes kept flicking toward her. Not with authority now, but with unease. He knew who she was, and he knew exactly what he had done that morning. By the time the prosecutor stepped back from the podium, Bill Wilkins looked nothing like the assertive officer who had stood in her way outside the courthouse. He was unraveling, a hollow figure exposed by his own words. Leah felt no pity, but she did feel the full weight of what was unfolding before her. This trial was no longer just about Kevin Daniels. It was about a system, a broken, dangerous system that had allowed officers like Bill to move through it unchecked, unquestioned, and unchallenged for far too long. As the trial pressed on, Leah steeled herself. She fought to keep her emotions buried beneath the surface, but inside, something had shifted. This case had always been personal, but now it was undeniable. She wasn't just presiding over justice. She was living in its shadow. She had to remain neutral. That was her duty, to uphold the law, to ensure justice was served. But it was getting harder. The parallels between her own experience that morning and the case unfolding in front of her were impossible to ignore. By the end of the day, the courtroom pulsed with tension. Everyone could feel it. In the stillness of the room, in the exchanged glances, in the quiet anticipation of the verdict to come. The defense attorney stood for his closing statement, painting Officer Bill Wilkins as a well-meaning officer who had simply made an honest mistake. But Leah had seen too much, and so had the jury. The weight of Wilkins's assumptions and the damage they caused could not be brushed away with words like misunderstanding or intentions. Then the prosecutor, Samantha Green, rose for her final argument. Her voice was clear, unwavering. "This case is not just about Kevin Daniels," she began, her gaze sweeping across the jurors. "It's about a pattern, one we've seen again and again in our justice system. A pattern where officers see a young black man in a neighborhood and assume the worst, that he doesn't belong, that he's suspicious, that he must be doing something wrong." She paused, letting the silence emphasize her words. It's about how that assumption leads to humiliation, wrongful arrest, and trauma that lingers long after the handcuffs are removed. And it's about accountability, not just for Officer Wilkins, but for the system that allowed this to happen. Samantha's voice dropped to a quieter, more resolute tone. "It's time we say, enough." A hush fell over the courtroom. No one moved. No one spoke. The shift was tangible, a collective understanding settling in. Leah felt it too. As the trial adjourned for the day, she dismissed the courtroom with a composed nod. But inside, her thoughts swirled. Justice, she reminded herself, must not only be done, it must be seen to be done. And today, it had stepped into the light. But she remained seated for a moment longer, her hands resting on the bench, her thoughts spinning. She had done her job, presided over the case with fairness and focus. Still, the encounter outside the courthouse gnawed at her. A sharp reminder that no matter her title, no matter her achievements, she would always be seen, by some, first and foremost, through the lens of her race. The door creaked open. Sergeant Michael Harris, the older officer who had intervened earlier, stepped inside. His face carried the weight of someone who had seen too much and done too little. He approached the bench quietly, his voice low and respectful. "Judge Marshall," he said gently, "can I have a word?" Leah looked up, surprised but composed. "Of course." Harris glanced over his shoulder, ensuring they were alone, then sighed. "I wanted to speak to you about what happened earlier. With Wilkins. He's not a bad kid. But he's got blind spots, like a lot of them do." Leah's eyes narrowed slightly, her tone cool. "Blind spots," she repeated, the words laced with controlled bitterness. "You mean racism?" Harris flinched at the word but didn't deny it. "Maybe. Probably. Yeah." He paused. "But I want you to know, I'm trying. From the inside. I'm trying to fix it." Leah studied him in silence. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe change was more than a promise, more than a nice sentiment offered in quiet hallways after damage had already been done. But belief was a fragile thing, and hers had been chipped away too many times. Her voice dropped, soft but firm. "And what do you suggest I do, Sergeant? When I'm sitting up here day after day, hearing cases like this, knowing what I've experienced firsthand?" Leah's voice trailed off, thick with frustration and fatigue. Harris was silent for a long time, his eyes downcast. Then he finally spoke, quietly but firmly. "You keep doing what you're doing, Judge. You keep holding people accountable. That's the only way things are going to change." Leah gave a small nod, though the weight on her shoulders didn't lift. His words were well meant, but they couldn't undo the years, the centuries, behind them. Still, there was truth in what he said. The fight wasn't hers alone, but she had a role in it. A powerful one. The trial wasn't over. There would be more testimony, more resistance, more doubt. But for today, she had taken a step forward. As Harris quietly left the room, Leah looked around the empty courtroom. The silence now felt different, not hollow, but full of meaning. The battle was far from over, but today, justice had found its voice. And that, she thought, was a start. The next morning, tension hung in the air like a storm about to break. The courthouse buzzed with anticipation. The jury had deliberated through the night, and today they would return with their verdict. Leah Marshall sat in her chambers, still and focused, her fingers loosely wrapped around a cup of coffee. The rich aroma did little to steady her nerves. She stared at the open case files on her desk, but wasn't reading them anymore. This trial had never just been about Kevin Daniels. It had grown into something larger, a mirror held up to the justice system, revealing the threads of bias woven into its fabric. People were watching, hoping, waiting. Leah closed the file slowly and exhaled. Whatever came next, she would face it, with clarity, with courage, and with the conviction that justice, though flawed, could still be pursued. She could hear the muffled sounds of reporters and protesters gathering outside the courthouse. What had started as a local story had exploded into a national headline, a symbol of the systemic racism still embedded in law enforcement. Her thoughts drifted back to the day before. Bill Wilkins, the officer who had racially profiled her at the courthouse doors, had sat in that very courtroom, visibly shaken. His testimony threatened to unravel the system he was sworn to uphold. Despite the courtroom's heavy silence, Leah had noticed the subtle cracks in his voice, the tension etched across his face. Bill wasn't an outlier. He was a product of a deeply flawed institution. This case was about more than just holding one officer accountable. It was about forcing a conversation America had long avoided. Leah had a duty to deliver justice in this case, but the weight of that responsibility pressed down on her like a mountain. This trial was a reflection of a larger issue, a call for reform in a system that had allowed bias and racial profiling to become routine. A soft knock at the door pulled her back to the present. "Come in," Leah said, her voice steadier than she felt. Her clerk, Emily, stepped inside holding a folder. "The jury's ready," she said, quietly. Leah nodded, rising from her chair. She took a deep breath, smoothing her robe, willing herself to stay steady. "Let me do this," she thought, as she made her way toward the courtroom. The sound of her footsteps echoed sharply down the long hallway. Today, the courthouse felt different. Tense, not just inside the courtroom, but in every corner of the building. Leah could feel it pressing in from all sides, an unspoken anxiety everyone seemed to carry. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was thick and stifling. Reporters filled the gallery, pens poised, and cameras ready. The families of both Kevin Daniels and Officer Wilkins sat in the front rows, each group tense and waiting. Leah took her place at the bench, her eyes briefly meeting Kevin Daniels, who sat beside his lawyer at the defense table. His face was somber, but in his eyes there was a flicker of hope, a hope that justice would be done, that this trial might actually make a difference. Her gaze shifted to Bill Wilkins. He looked a shadow of the man from the day before, eyes darting nervously around the room. For the first time since the trial began, he seemed small, like a man finally coming to terms with the weight of what he had done. Leah cleared her throat. "Please bring in the jury." She spoke, her voice echoing through the quiet courtroom. The doors opened, and the 12 jurors filed in, each taking their seats. Leah watched them closely, searching their faces for any hint of the verdict, but their expressions remained unreadable, eyes fixed straight ahead. The jury foreman, a middle-aged woman with dark hair pulled tightly into a bun, stepped forward, clutching a slip of paper like a lifeline. Leah gave a subtle nod. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" she asked. The foreman's hands trembled slightly as she unfolded the paper. "Yes, Your Honor," she said, her voice wavering just enough to reveal the weight of the moment. "Please read the verdict," Leah instructed, her own heart pounding in her chest despite her composed exterior. The foreman glanced down at the paper, then back up, her voice growing steadier and more resolute. "In the case of Officer Bill Wilkins, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty of wrongful arrest and racial discrimination." A murmur swept through the courtroom. Leah's eyes flicked to Kevin Daniels, who sat frozen, his face blank for a heartbeat before a wave of relief washed over him. His lawyer reached over to gently pat his back. Kevin's eyes glistened, tears held back, but undeniable. Leah then shifted her gaze toward Bill Wilkins. He stared straight ahead, his face pale, hands clenched tightly in his lap. The weight of the verdict pressed down on him, and for a moment it seemed like he might crumble. Leah banged her gavel sharply. "Court is adjourned." As the room stirred, reporters scrambling for exits, people filing out, Bill suddenly stood. "Your Honor," he said, his voice cracking. Leah paused, looking down at him. The courtroom fell silent again, all eyes locked on the young officer. His body visibly trembled, face drained of color, as he struggled to find the words. I need to say something," he stammered, swallowing hard. His gaze dropped to the floor. "I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was protecting the community. But I was wrong." His voice wavered, thick with emotion. "I see now that I let my assumptions, my prejudices, cloud my judgment. And I'm sorry." The silence that followed was deafening. Leah felt her breath hitch. It was an apology, yes, but it wasn't enough. It couldn't undo what had been done. Her mind raced through every moment, every injustice masked by ignorance and bias. She had been in Kevin's shoes, stopped for nothing more than being black. Leah knew that while the apology might be sincere, it wouldn't erase those lived experiences. Meeting his eyes, her voice steady but firm, she said, "Your apology is noted, Officer Wilkins. But the harm caused by your actions, by actions like yours, runs deep. It affects lives, families, and entire communities. Saying sorry doesn't fix that." Bill nodded, defeated. He didn't argue or try to explain further. He simply stood there, accepting the weight of his actions. For the first time, Leah saw a flicker of true understanding in his eyes. The courtroom slowly emptied. Leah stayed seated a moment longer, watching Kevin Daniels embrace his family. His face a mix of relief and exhaustion. Bill Wilkins stood quietly near the exit, waiting to be escorted out, the burden of guilt heavy on his shoulders. Leah's mind raced. She had done her job, upheld the law, presided fairly. But it wasn't enough. This trial was one drop in a vast ocean of injustice. For every Kevin Daniels who received a semblance of justice, countless others remained unheard, their stories never reaching a courtroom. Suddenly, the courtroom door opened again, and Sergeant Michael Harris walked in. Leah looked up, surprised to see him. He approached quietly, his face a mix of concern and something else, something like hope. "Judge Marshall," he said softly, "can I have a word?" Leah nodded, gesturing for him to sit. "Of course." Harris settled into the chair, folding his hands in front of him. "I just wanted to say thank you." Leah raised an eyebrow. "For what?" "For handling this case the way you did," Harris replied. "For holding us accountable. We need that. The system needs that." Leah let out a long breath, leaning back in her chair. "I appreciate that, Sam, but it doesn't feel like enough. This was just one case. There are so many more out there. So many people who don't get justice." Harris nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You're right. But that's why we have to keep pushing. It's not going to change overnight. But every step matters. Every case like this chips away at the bigger problem." Leah was silent for a moment, weighing his words. She wanted to believe him, to believe that real change was possible. But after everything she'd seen, it was hard to keep that hope alive. "What about Wilkins?" she asked quietly. What happens to officers like him? The ones who've been taught to think a certain way? Harris sighed. "I'm not going to lie. It's hard. There are a lot of guys like him. But there are also people like me trying to change things from the inside, and I'll keep doing that as long as I can." Leah looked at him, noticing the weariness in his eyes, but also the determination. The same determination she felt, despite the setbacks and frustrations. "You keep doing what you're doing, Judge," Harris said. "That's how we change this, piece by piece." Leah nodded slowly. "Piece by piece," she echoed. As Harris left the room, Leah sat back in her chair, staring at the empty courtroom. The fight wasn't over. It never would be. But today, they had taken one step forward. And that, she thought, was how change began. As the courtroom emptied and the echoes of the verdict still hung in the air, Leah Marshall remained seated at the bench. Her mind buzzed with the weight of what had just transpired, but it wasn't a victory she could savor. The trial was over, but its impact had only just begun. For Leah, the fight for justice wasn't confined to this room. It stretched far beyond these walls, into communities still grappling with the same issues that brought Kevin Daniels here in the first place. She stood up, gathering her files. Her thoughts were interrupted by a quiet voice. It was Kevin Daniels approaching with his attorney. His face was calm now, though the tension from the past few days had clearly taken its toll. "Judge Marshall," Kevin said, his voice low but steady, "I just wanted to thank you. For everything." Leah looked at him, pausing before she replied, "You don't need to thank me, Kevin. I was just doing my job." Kevin shook his head gently. "No, it's more than that. This trial, it wasn't just about me. It was about showing people what really happens out there, what we go through. You gave me a voice." Leah felt her chest tighten. She understood exactly what he meant and nodded. "I hope this is a step toward change," she said carefully, choosing her words. "But it's just one case. There's still a long way to go." Kevin's eyes softened with understanding. "I know, but it's a start. And for that, I'm grateful." Leah watched him walk away, his attorney close behind, and couldn't shake the feeling that so much more still needed to be done. One trial, one verdict. It wasn't enough to dismantle a system built over centuries. But she knew Kevin was right. It was a start. She sighed and began making her way toward her chambers, her footsteps slow and deliberate. The media had already swarmed the front entrance, so she chose to exit through the side door, hoping to avoid the cameras and microphones that would inevitably be thrust in her face. But as soon as she pushed the door open, Leah found herself face to face with Officer Bill Wilkins. He stood against the side of the building, leaning on the wall, his face drawn and pale. His uniform seemed to hang loosely on him now, as if the weight of the trial had physically shrunk him down. Leah stopped in her tracks, her heart pounding. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The tension between them was thick, a fragile mix of guilt, anger, and confusion hanging in the air. "Judge Marshall," Bill began, his voice hoarse. He straightened, locking eyes with her. I didn't expect to see you here." Leah said nothing, waiting for him to continue. She didn't know what he could possibly say to change anything, but she gave him the moment. "I've been thinking," Bill said slowly, each word heavy, "about everything, about what happened in there and what I did to you." He paused, his hands nervously fidgeting at his sides. "I know," Bill began, voice low. "Saying sorry isn't enough. It won't fix what I did. But I need you to know, I never meant for any of this to happen." Leah's eyes narrowed. She had heard this before, variations of the same apology countless times. "You didn't mean for it to happen," she repeated, her voice cold and steady. "But it did happen, Officer Wilkins, and it keeps happening, to people like Kevin, to people like me. So forgive me if I'm not moved by your remorse right now." Bill winced, but didn't step back. "I know I screwed up. I know I let my biases take control. And I'm trying, really trying, to understand that now. But it's not as simple as just unlearning everything overnight. I was taught to see things a certain way, and I didn't question it. Until now." Leah crossed her arms, her expression still stern. And what changed? The fact that you got caught? Or that someone finally called you out? Leah was silent for a moment, turning over his words in her mind. She wanted to believe him, to believe that change was possible. But after everything she'd witnessed, hope was fragile, hard to keep alive. "What about Wilkins?" she asked quietly. "What happens to officers like him? Ones who've been taught to think a certain way?" Harris sighed deeply. "I'm not going to lie," Harris said quietly. "It's hard. There are a lot of guys like him, but there are also people like me, trying to change things from the inside. And I'll keep doing that as long as I can." Leah looked at him, seeing the weariness in his eyes, but also the fierce determination. It was the same determination she felt, despite the setbacks, despite the frustrations. "You keep doing what you're doing," Judge Harris urged. "That's how we change this, piece by piece." Leah nodded slowly, letting the words settle. "Piece by piece," she echoed softly. As Harris left the room, Leah sank back into her chair, staring at the empty courtroom. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. But today they had taken one step forward. And maybe, just maybe, that was how change began. The echoes of the verdict still lingered in the air as Leah Marshall remained seated at the bench, her mind buzzing with the weight of everything that had just transpired. It wasn't a victory she could savor. The trial was over, but its impact was only beginning. For Leah, the fight for justice wasn't confined to this courtroom. It stretched far beyond these walls, into communities still grappling with the same issues that had brought Kevin Daniels here in the first place. She stood up, gathering her files, when a voice interrupted her thoughts. It was Kevin Daniels, approaching with his attorney. His face was calm now, though the tension of the past few days had clearly taken its toll. "Judge Marshall," Kevin said softly, his voice low but steady. "I just wanted to say thank you for everything." Leah looked at him, pausing for a moment before responding. "You don't need to thank me, Kevin. I was just doing my job." Kevin shook his head. "No, it's more than that. This trial, it wasn't just about me. It was about showing people what really happens out there, what we go through. You gave me a voice." Leah's chest tightened. She understood exactly what he meant, and she nodded slowly. "I hope this is a step toward change," she said, her words carefully chosen. "But it's just one case. We still have a long way to go." Kevin's eyes softened with understanding. "I know, but it's a start, and for that, I'm grateful." Leah watched him leave, his attorney close behind, and she couldn't shake the feeling that there was so much more left to be done. One trial, one verdict. It wasn't enough to dismantle a system built over centuries, but she knew Kevin was right. It was a start. She sighed and began making her way to her chambers, her footsteps slow and deliberate. The media had already swarmed the front entrance, so she chose to exit through the side door, hoping once again to avoid the cameras and microphones that would inevitably be thrust in her face. But as soon as she pushed the door open, Leah found herself face to face with Officer Bill Wilkins. He was standing by the side of the building, leaning against the wall. His face was drawn and pale, and his uniform seemed too big for him now, as if the weight of the trial had physically shrunk him. Leah stopped in her tracks, her heart thudding in her chest. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The tension between them was thick, an uneasy mix of guilt, anger, and confusion hanging heavy in the air. "Judge Marshall," Bill began, his voice hoarse. He straightened up, his eyes locking onto hers. I didn't expect to see you here." Leah remained silent, waiting for him to continue. She wasn't sure what he could possibly say to change anything, but she gave him the moment. "I've been thinking," Bill said slowly, his words heavy. About everything. About what happened in there. And about what I did to you. He paused, his hands fidgeting nervously at his sides. I know saying sorry isn't enough. It won't fix what I did. But I need you to know, I didn't mean for any of this to happen. Leah's eyes narrowed. She had heard this before, countless variations of the same apology. You didn't mean for it to happen, she repeated, her voice cold. But it did happen, Officer Wilkins, and it keeps happening. To people like Kevin, to people like me. So forgive me if I'm not moved by your remorse right now. Bill winced, but didn't back down. I know I screwed up. I know I let my biases take over, and I'm trying to understand that now. But it's not as simple as just unlearning everything overnight. I was taught to see things a certain way, and I didn't question it. Until now. Leah crossed her arms, her face still stern. And what changed? That you got caught? Or that someone finally called you out on it?